Welcome, and thank you for being here. Before we begin, take a moment to slow down, settle in, and let your attention drift away from the noise of the present day. Tonight's story does not rush. It does not shout. Instead, it invites you to look backward quietly, thoughtfully into a past that is often misunderstood. When we imagine ancient civilizations, many of us instinctively picture something simple or unfinished. We imagine early humans struggling against nature, surviving day to day, limited by primitive tools and incomplete knowledge. This image has been repeated so often that it feels almost natural to accept it as truth. Yet history, when examined closely, tells a very different story. Long before the modern world took shape, there were societies that displayed remarkable levels of organization, creativity, and intelligence. These were not accidental achievements, nor were they the result of luck. They were the outcome of generations of observation, experimentation, and collective knowledge. In many cases, these societies built systems so effective and so well balanced that they endured for centuries, sometimes even millennia, without the technologies we now consider essential. What makes these civilizations especially fascinating is not how they ended, but how they lived. Their disappearance was often quiet, gradual, and almost invisible to the historical record. There were no dramatic final battles, no sudden collapses recorded in vivid detail. Instead, they faded, leaving behind structures, patterns, and unanswered questions that continue to challenge modern assumptions. Today's story begins with a simple but powerful idea, that progress is not a straight line. Human intelligence did not steadily increase from primitive beginnings to modern sophistication. Instead, history reveals waves of advancement, periods where knowledge surged, systems flourished, and societies reached levels of complexity that would not be matched again for centuries. These ancient communities understood their environments with a depth that is difficult to grasp today. They tracked the movement of the sun, moon, and stars with precision, not out of curiosity alone, but because these patterns shaped agriculture, architecture, and social order. Their calendars were accurate enough to predict seasonal changes critical for survival. Their cities were often aligned with celestial events, reflecting a worldview where nature and human design were deeply interconnected. Organization was another defining feature. These societies managed large populations without modern bureaucracy, digital records, or instant communication. Instead, they relied on shared cultural norms, carefully designed social roles, and systems of responsibility passed down through tradition. Labor was coordinated on a massive scale, allowing for the construction of monuments, road networks, and irrigation systems that still inspire awe today. What is perhaps most striking is how efficiently many of these societies functioned. They built with local materials, adapted to regional climates, and developed techniques that minimized waste. Water was collected, stored, and distributed with precision. Food systems were designed to be resilient, capable of withstanding periods of uncertainty without immediate collapse. In some cases, these methods were so sustainable that they outperformed modern solutions developed thousands of years later. Yet despite all this sophistication, many of these civilizations left behind very little written explanation of how their systems worked. Some relied primarily on oral tradition. Others used writing systems that remain undeciphered or only partially understood. As a result, modern historians are often left interpreting physical evidence without the voices of the people who created it. This absence of explanation has led to assumptions. When we cannot immediately understand how something was built or managed, we tend to underestimate the intelligence behind it. We label it mysterious, primitive, or symbolic, rather than technical or intentional. But mystery does not equal ignorance. Often, it simply reflects a gap between our modern perspective and the worldview of the past. Another important aspect of these societies is how deeply connected they were to time, not just as a measurement, but as a concept. Many ancient cultures viewed time as cyclical rather than linear. Seasons returned. Patterns repeated. Stability was valued over constant expansion. This mindset shaped how cities were planned, how resources were shared, and how communities responded to change. Because of this, decline did not always come in the form of collapse. Sometimes, societies transformed. Populations migrated. Centers of activity shifted. Knowledge was absorbed into neighboring cultures, altered, and carried forward in quieter ways. What appears to us as disappearance may have felt, to them, like adaptation. Modern history often favors dramatic endings because they are easier to document and easier to remember. Fires, invasions, and sudden disasters leave clear marks. But gradual change leaves subtler traces, changes in building styles, shifts in settlement patterns, or the slow abandonment of once busy spaces. These are harder to turn into neat stories, but they are no less important. As we explore these forgotten or misunderstood societies, we are not just learning about the past. We are challenging our assumptions about the present. The idea that modern civilization represents the peak of human organization is comforting, but it may not be entirely accurate. In some areas, ancient societies achieved balances that we still struggle to maintain today. This does not mean that the past was perfect or that modern life is inferior. Rather, it reminds us that intelligence takes many forms, and progress can be lost as easily as it is gained. Knowledge can fade if it is not preserved, valued, and passed on. Systems can disappear not because they failed, but because the world around them changed. Tonight's journey is about recognizing that silence in history does not mean absence of achievement. It means we must listen more carefully. It means paying attention to what remains: stone foundations, worn pathways, aligned structures, and subtle patterns etched into the landscape. As we move forward in this story, we will look at societies that did not announce their end with chaos or destruction. Instead, they stepped quietly out of the historical spotlight, leaving behind evidence of lives lived with intention, skill, and deep understanding. So stay with me. Let the pace remain slow. Let curiosity replace assumption. And as we explore these advanced societies that vanished in silence, keep one thought in mind: the past is not as distant from us as it seems, and its lessons are often hidden not in what was said, but in what was left behind. The most misleading assumption about ancient societies is that complexity requires modern tools. We often believe that without digital systems, industrial machinery, or centralized technology, large-scale organization would be impossible. Yet the archaeological record quietly contradicts this belief again and again. Across different continents and time periods, evidence reveals societies capable of coordinating thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of people with remarkable efficiency. Cities were planned, resources were allocated, labor was synchronized, and long-term goals were pursued without written spreadsheets, electronic communication, or instant feedback. What replaced these tools was something far more subtle: deeply embedded systems of social order, shared knowledge, and collective responsibility. Urban layouts offer the first clues. Many ancient cities were not chaotic clusters of buildings but carefully designed environments. Streets followed intentional patterns. Residential areas were separated from ceremonial or administrative spaces. Public infrastructure such as roads, drainage systems, and storage facilities were integrated into the city's design from the beginning rather than added later. This level of planning suggests foresight measured not in months, but in generations. Construction alone required extraordinary coordination. Large structures demanded consistent access to materials, skilled labor, and time management. Stone had to be quarried, transported, shaped, and assembled. Wood had to be selected, treated, and fitted. These processes could not be improvised. They depended on schedules, division of labor, and an understanding of structural principles that went beyond trial and error. What is striking is not only that these societies built large projects, but that they did so repeatedly and sustainably. This implies stable systems that functioned over long periods without collapsing under their own complexity. Leadership roles existed, but power was often distributed across councils, guilds, or ritual authorities rather than concentrated in a single permanent ruler. Decision-making was frequently tied to tradition, seasonal cycles, or communal consensus. Food production was another cornerstone of organization. Agriculture was not simply about planting and harvesting. It involved land management, crop rotation, irrigation control, and storage planning. Many societies engineered landscapes to suit their needs, reshaping terrain to prevent flooding, retain moisture, or maximize sunlight. These interventions required collective effort and long-term maintenance, suggesting a shared understanding of cause and effect across generations. Storage systems reveal how seriously future planning was taken. Granaries, underground caches, and sealed containers indicate that surplus was not consumed immediately but preserved for periods of scarcity. This foresight reduced vulnerability to unpredictable conditions and allowed populations to grow without constant crisis. It also implies systems of trust, where stored resources were protected for communal benefit rather than individual gain. Trade networks further demonstrate advanced organization. Materials found far from their sources, stone, shells, metals, pigments, show that these societies maintained long-distance exchange routes. Such networks required standardized measures, mutual agreements, and social protocols that minimized conflict. Trade was not random. It was regulated, reliable, and often symbolic as well as practical. Social roles within these societies were clearly defined. Individuals were not interchangeable labor units but specialists: builders, farmers, artisans, healers, astronomers, and caretakers of knowledge. Skills were passed down through apprenticeship and tradition rather than formal institutions. This continuity allowed expertise to deepen over time, refining techniques rather than reinventing them. What often goes unnoticed is how conflict was managed. While no society was entirely free of tension, many ancient communities developed mechanisms to reduce internal instability. Rituals, shared narratives, and moral codes reinforced cooperation. Disputes were addressed through established customs rather than constant force. Stability was valued not just as a political goal, but as a cultural ideal. Time management played a crucial role. Without clocks or calendars in the modern sense, societies relied on environmental cues: solar positions, lunar cycles, seasonal changes. These natural rhythms structured work, rest, ceremony, and governance. By aligning social systems with predictable natural patterns, these communities reduced uncertainty and coordinated collective action with remarkable precision. One of the most revealing aspects of ancient organization is what is missing: excessive redundancy. Systems were often elegant rather than overbuilt. Solutions were adapted to local conditions, using available materials and knowledge. This efficiency suggests a deep familiarity with constraints and a willingness to work within them rather than override them. Modern observers sometimes mistake the absence of written bureaucracy for the absence of order. In reality, oral systems can be highly sophisticated. Memory, repetition, and ritual encoded essential information: laws, histories, procedures into cultural practices. Knowledge lived in people, not documents, making it resilient in different ways. The decline of these organized systems is frequently misunderstood. When populations shifted or structures were abandoned, it is tempting to interpret this as failure. But in many cases, it reflects adaptation. Environmental changes, trade realignments, or cultural evolution altered priorities. Systems that were once optimal became less relevant, and communities adjusted accordingly. Importantly, complexity does not always leave obvious traces. When wooden structures decay, when textiles vanish, when spoken knowledge fades, what remains is incomplete. Stone foundations survive, but the social architecture that sustained them often does not. This imbalance skews interpretation, making societies appear simpler than they truly were. Recognizing the organizational sophistication of ancient societies challenges the narrative of linear progress. It suggests that humans have repeatedly discovered effective ways to cooperate at scale, sometimes losing them later due to changing circumstances. Complexity is not guaranteed to accumulate. It must be maintained. This understanding reframes how we view modern challenges. Many issues we face today, resource management, urban planning, social cohesion, are not new. Ancient societies confronted them with different tools but comparable intelligence. Their successes and limitations offer insight not because they were perfect, but because they were human. As the evidence accumulates, it becomes increasingly difficult to dismiss these societies as merely transitional steps towards something better. They were complete systems in their own right, shaped by their environments, values, and collective choices. Their organization was not accidental, nor was it naive. The silence that surrounds their disappearance does not negate their achievements. It simply reflects the fragility of memory. When stories are not written down, when languages fade, when traditions break, complexity becomes invisible to those who come later. Understanding this is essential before moving deeper into their technologies, beliefs, and knowledge systems. Without acknowledging their capacity for organization, everything else appears exaggerated or implausible. With it, their accomplishments begin to make sense not as mysteries, but as outcomes of deliberate human effort. One of the most persistent misunderstandings about ancient societies is the belief that their constructions were the result of simple methods applied over long periods of time. The assumption suggests that with enough labor and patience, complexity will eventually emerge. However, the physical evidence left behind tells a very different story, one of precision, planning, and deep technical understanding. Many ancient structures exhibit levels of accuracy that are difficult to explain without advanced knowledge of geometry, physics, and material behavior. Stones weighing several tons were shaped to fit together so closely that even thin blades cannot pass between them. Walls remain standing after centuries of environmental stress, seismic activity, and erosion. These outcomes were not accidental. They reflect intentional design choices grounded in experience and experimentation. Engineering begins with measurement, and measurement requires standards. Ancient builders clearly understood proportions, angles, and alignment. Structures were laid out with consistent ratios, repeated across different sites and regions. This consistency suggests shared knowledge systems rather than isolated experimentation. Even without standardized units in the modern sense, relative measurement allowed builders to reproduce designs reliably. Foundations reveal further sophistication. Rather than placing heavy structures directly on unstable ground, many societies engineered layered bases that distributed weight and absorbed movement. Gravel beds, compacted earth, and interlocking stone systems reduced stress and prevented collapse. These methods resemble principles used in modern civil engineering, yet they were developed through observation rather than formal equations. Material selection was equally deliberate. Stone types were chosen based on durability, workability, and resistance to weather. In regions prone to earthquakes, flexible materials or jointed construction techniques were favored. In wetter climates, elevated platforms and drainage channels protected buildings from moisture damage. These choices demonstrate an understanding of environmental forces acting over long periods. Transporting materials posed another challenge that required innovation. Massive stones were moved across long distances without wheeled vehicles or modern machinery. The solutions varied: ramps, sleds, rollers, waterways, but all required careful planning and coordination. The landscape itself was often modified to facilitate transport, turning terrain into part of the engineering system rather than an obstacle. What is often overlooked is the energy efficiency of these methods. Instead of forcing materials into place through brute strength alone, ancient engineers leveraged gravity, leverage, and balance. Inclines reduced lifting requirements. Counterweights minimized effort. Timing construction with seasonal conditions optimized labor and reduced risk. These strategies reflect an intuitive grasp of mechanical principles. Structural longevity provides the strongest argument against the idea of primitive engineering. Many ancient constructions have outlasted far newer buildings. This durability was not achieved through excess material alone, but through intelligent design. Load paths were anticipated. Stress points were reinforced. Redundancies were built into systems without unnecessary complexity. Water management stands as one of the clearest examples of advanced engineering. Channels, aqueducts, cisterns, and reservoirs controlled water flow with remarkable precision. Gradients were calculated to maintain consistent movement without erosion. Overflow systems prevented damage during heavy rainfall. Access points allowed maintenance without dismantling entire structures. These systems required more than technical skill. They required long-term planning. Water infrastructure often extended beyond city boundaries, integrating natural sources into urban life. Maintenance schedules were implicit in design, ensuring functionality across generations. Such foresight contradicts the idea of short-term thinking often attributed to ancient communities. Thermal regulation was another area of expertise. Building orientation, wall thickness, ventilation paths, and material choice all contributed to temperature control. In hot regions, structures minimized direct sunlight and promoted airflow. In colder climates, insulation and heat retention were prioritized. These passive systems reduced reliance on external energy sources. The absence of visible tools often leads to underestimation of capability. Tools made from wood, bone, or softer metals rarely survive, skewing perception. Yet tool marks preserved in stone reveal consistent techniques, controlled force, and repeatable methods. This implies training, standardization, and knowledge transfer. Knowledge transmission did not rely on written manuals. Instead, it was embedded in practice. Apprentices learned by doing, absorbing principles through repetition and correction. Mistakes were costly, which encouraged careful instruction and gradual responsibility. Over time, this process refined techniques beyond what individual experimentation could achieve. It is also important to recognize what ancient engineers chose not to build. Not every society pursued vertical monuments or massive enclosures. Some focused on infrastructure hidden beneath the surface: drainage, foundations, agricultural terraces. These choices reflect priorities shaped by environment and values rather than technical limitation. When examining abandoned structures, deterioration is often mistaken for original weakness. In reality, many buildings were designed with maintenance in mind. Once communities shifted or dispersed, upkeep ceased, accelerating decay. What survives is often the most durable portion of a much larger system. Modern attempts to replicate ancient constructions sometimes struggle because they overlook context. Using modern tools without understanding original constraints can lead to misleading conclusions. Ancient builders worked with intimate knowledge of their materials, environment, and labor dynamics. Their solutions were optimized for their specific conditions, not ours. This perspective reframes engineering as a cultural expression. Techniques were not isolated innovations but part of a broader worldview that valued balance, continuity, and harmony with natural forces. Engineering decisions reflected social organization, belief systems, and long-term goals. The idea that advanced engineering requires modern technology is a projection of contemporary experience onto the past. In reality, technology is only one pathway to precision. Observation, iteration, and collective memory can achieve similar outcomes through different means. Understanding this helps explain why some ancient structures appear unmatched even today. It is not because they possessed lost technologies beyond imagination, but because they optimized what they had to a degree that is rare in any era. As these societies faded or transformed, their engineering knowledge did not always transfer intact. New priorities, materials, or social structures altered practices. Over time, techniques were simplified, forgotten, or replaced. What remains is a fragmentary record that challenges assumptions but rarely explains itself. Recognizing the precision of ancient engineering is essential to appreciating the full scope of these societies. It shifts the narrative from mystery to mastery, from speculation to respect. These were not people guessing their way through construction. They were problem solvers working within known limits, refining solutions across generations. This realization opens the door to deeper questions not about how they built, but why they built the way they did. Those questions lead beyond tools and techniques, into belief, purpose, and the relationship between human ambition and the world it inhabits. Across ancient societies, the sky was not a distant backdrop. It was a living reference system that guided decisions on Earth. The movement of the sun, moon, and stars shaped architecture, agriculture, ritual life, and social order. This was not superstition layered on top of daily life, but a practical framework for understanding time, change, and continuity. Structures aligned with celestial events appear across continents. Openings that frame sunrise on specific days, corridors illuminated only during seasonal transitions, and monuments positioned to track lunar cycles suggest deliberate design rather than coincidence. These alignments required long-term observation. Patterns had to be recorded mentally, refined through repetition, and shared across generations. Time was not treated as an abstract sequence of numbers. It was experienced through cycles, growth and decay, light and darkness, return and departure. This cyclical view reduced uncertainty. When the future follows recognizable patterns, planning becomes possible. Agricultural schedules, construction phases, and communal gatherings were all synchronized with predictable celestial rhythms. Calendrical systems emerged from this awareness. Without mechanical clocks, societies developed reliable ways to mark days, months, and years. Shadows cast by fixed markers, the position of stars at dawn, and the length of daylight provided consistent reference points. These systems were accurate enough to anticipate seasonal shifts critical for food production and resource management. What stands out is how deeply this temporal knowledge was integrated into physical space. Cities were not merely places to live, they were instruments for observing time. Towers, platforms, and sightlines turned the built environment into a calendar that anyone could read. Knowledge was embedded in stone and orientation rather than confined to specialists alone. This shared access to timekeeping strengthened social cohesion. When everyone understands the same temporal framework, coordination becomes easier. Work cycles align. Ceremonies reinforce collective memory. Decision-making follows expected rhythms, reducing conflict caused by uncertainty or misalignment. Astronomical knowledge also informed navigation and trade. Familiarity with star patterns allowed travelers to orient themselves across vast distances. Seasonal markers indicated safe periods for movement or exchange. These skills expanded interaction between communities while maintaining predictable boundaries. The sky also provided a language for meaning. Celestial events were interpreted as reflections of balance, transition, or renewal. This symbolism reinforced values tied to stability and continuity rather than constant expansion. Architecture echoed these themes, emphasizing harmony and proportion over scale alone. Importantly, this knowledge was cumulative. Observations made by one generation were refined by the next. Small discrepancies were corrected over time. This process required patience and institutional memory, even without written records. Oral transmission, ritual repetition, and architectural alignment ensured accuracy was preserved. Mistakes carried consequences. Misreading seasonal cues could lead to failed harvests or misallocated labor. This risk encouraged careful observation and conservative interpretation. Over time, reliable patterns were favored over speculation, grounding belief systems in empirical experience. The integration of time and space influenced governance as well. Leadership roles were often tied to the ability to interpret cycles correctly. Authority came not from control alone, but from alignment with established rhythms. Decisions made out of season or against expected patterns risked losing legitimacy. This framework also moderated growth. Cyclical time discourages endless accumulation. Periods of rest, renewal, and restraint were built into social expectations. Expansion was balanced by contraction. Resource use followed rhythms that allowed recovery rather than exhaustion. Modern observers sometimes misinterpret this restraint as stagnation. In reality, it reflects a different definition of success, one measured by continuity rather than acceleration. Longevity mattered more than speed. Stability outweighed novelty. Architectural remains illustrate this mindset. Instead of frequent rebuilding, structures were designed to endure. Repairs followed predictable intervals. Materials aged alongside the society rather than being constantly replaced. This reduced waste and reinforced a sense of permanence. The decline of these systems often coincided with disruptions to their temporal frameworks. Climate shifts altered seasonal patterns. Migration introduced different cycles and interpretations. Trade expanded faster than traditional rhythms could accommodate. When shared temporal understanding fractured, coordination weakened. This breakdown did not happen overnight. It unfolded gradually, often without dramatic events. Structures continued to stand, but their meanings shifted. Alignments lost relevance. Ritual calendars fell out of sync with lived experience. Over time, the systems that once unified communities became less effective. What remains today are fragments, stone markers, aligned corridors, and repeated orientations that hint at a sophisticated understanding of time. Without the cultural context that animated them, these features can seem decorative or symbolic rather than functional. Recognizing their original purpose changes interpretation entirely. These were not monuments built for display alone. They were tools, interfaces between human life and natural cycles. They translated the sky into usable knowledge. This perspective challenges modern assumptions about intelligence. Advanced understanding does not require advanced instruments. Careful observation, collective memory, and patience can produce systems of remarkable accuracy. The sky served as a constant reference, available to anyone willing to watch long enough. The loss of this knowledge does not imply failure. It reflects changing priorities. As societies shifted toward different modes of organization, the centrality of celestial cycles diminished. Time became abstracted, measured mechanically rather than experienced environmentally. Yet the traces remain, reminding us that human understanding once moved at a different pace. A pace aligned with seasons rather than seconds. A pace that valued predictability over immediacy. Understanding how deeply time shaped ancient societies provides essential context for everything else they created. Their engineering, organization, and cultural practices all rested on this foundation. Without it, their achievements appear isolated. With it, they form a coherent system. This realization invites a quieter form of respect. Not admiration for lost wonders, but recognition of a worldview that integrated knowledge, environment, and community into a single rhythm. A rhythm that sustained societies long enough to leave marks still visible today. And it prepares the ground for the next question, not how they measured time, but how they managed resources within it. That question leads directly into how these societies sustained themselves, without exhausting the world around them. Sustainability was not an abstract concept for ancient societies. It was a daily necessity shaped by direct dependence on land, water, and climate. Survival required balance, and balance demanded restraint. The systems these societies developed were designed not for short-term gain, but for continuity across generations. Resource use followed clear patterns. Land was cultivated in ways that preserved fertility rather than exhausting it. Crop rotation, fallow periods, and mixed planting reduced vulnerability to disease and soil depletion. These practices were refined through observation rather than theory, guided by outcomes measured over decades. Water management again reveals long-term thinking. Rather than extracting as much as possible, ancient systems focused on regulation. Channels distributed flow evenly. Reservoirs buffered against drought. Overflow paths protected infrastructure during heavy rainfall. These designs reduced extremes, smoothing variability rather than attempting to eliminate it. Forests and wild areas were often integrated into resource strategies rather than cleared entirely. Trees stabilized soil, regulated microclimates, and provided renewable materials. Controlled harvesting allowed regeneration. This approach reflected an understanding that ecosystems function as interconnected systems rather than isolated assets. Population growth was implicitly managed through social structures. Settlement sizes reflected local carrying capacity. When resources became strained, migration or decentralization occurred. Instead of forcing expansion, communities adjusted scale. This flexibility prevented catastrophic collapse and allowed knowledge to spread rather than concentrate dangerously. Food storage played a stabilizing role. Surplus was preserved for lean periods, reducing the impact of seasonal variation. Storage systems were protected and maintained collectively, reinforcing trust and shared responsibility. Access was regulated through customs rather than constant oversight. Energy use remained proportionate. Human and animal labor were supplemented by natural forces: water flow, wind, gravity. These sources provided consistent power without depleting resources. By aligning activity with available energy, societies avoided unsustainable acceleration. Waste management was equally intentional. Materials were reused, repurposed, or returned to the environment in ways that supported regeneration. Organic waste enriched soil. Broken tools were reworked. Minimal reliance on non-renewable inputs reduced long-term accumulation of harm. Social values reinforced these practices. Excess was often discouraged. Status came from stewardship rather than accumulation. Rituals and narratives emphasized continuity, reminding individuals that their actions affected future generations. These cultural mechanisms substituted for formal regulation. Trade expanded options without undermining balance. Exchange allowed access to scarce materials while reducing pressure on local environments. Because trade networks relied on mutual benefit, exploitation was limited by reciprocity. Disruption risked isolation, encouraging restraint. Importantly, sustainability did not mean stagnation. Innovation occurred, but within constraints. New techniques were adopted when they proved compatible with existing systems. Rapid change was approached cautiously, recognizing that unintended consequences could unfold slowly but persistently. The durability of these systems is evident in their longevity. Many functioned for centuries without exhausting their environments. When stress accumulated, responses were adaptive rather than extractive. Systems shifted rather than intensified. Decline often followed external disruption rather than internal failure. Climate shifts altered rainfall patterns. New populations introduced different practices. Trade routes changed. These factors strained existing balances. When adaptation lagged behind change, sustainability weakened. The disappearance of these societies does not negate their success. Maintaining balance over long periods is itself an achievement. Few modern systems can claim comparable stability. Their legacy challenges assumptions that sustainability requires advanced technology or centralized control. Understanding these systems reframes environmental history. It suggests that human societies are capable of living within limits when values, knowledge, and organization align. Sustainability emerges not from restriction alone, but from integration. This perspective also complicates narratives of progress. Increased capacity does not guarantee increased resilience. Growth without balance accelerates vulnerability. Ancient societies recognized this implicitly, embedding limits into their structures. What remains today are landscapes shaped by careful use rather than exploitation. Terraces that prevent erosion. Canals that still guide water. Soils enriched by centuries of mindful cultivation. These traces testify to systems that worked. Modern observers may overlook these achievements because they lack spectacle. Sustainability leaves subtle marks. Its success is measured by what did not happen: collapse avoided, resources preserved, communities maintained. Recognizing this challenges how success is defined. Endurance becomes a metric equal to innovation. Restraint becomes a form of intelligence. Adaptation becomes a sign of strength rather than weakness. As these systems faded, newer approaches replaced them, often prioritizing efficiency over balance. Short-term gains overshadowed long-term consequences. The knowledge that once guided restraint became less central. Yet the lessons remain accessible. They are written into landscapes, practices, and patterns that persist long after societies themselves have changed. Learning to read these signs requires patience and humility. Understanding how ancient societies sustained life prepares the ground for a deeper question: how knowledge itself was preserved, transmitted, and sometimes lost. That question reveals why so much of their wisdom faded quietly rather than being carried forward intact. Much of what ancient societies knew never existed as written text. Knowledge lived in memory, practice, and repetition. It was carried by people rather than stored in objects. This made it flexible, adaptive, and deeply integrated into daily life, but also vulnerable in ways that are often misunderstood. Oral transmission was not casual storytelling. It followed strict structures designed to preserve accuracy. Information was embedded in rhythm, pattern, and repetition, making it easier to remember and harder to alter unintentionally. Stories carried practical instruction alongside meaning, blending explanation with cultural values. Skills were taught through direct experience. Apprentices learned by observing, imitating, and gradually taking responsibility under guidance. Correction was immediate. Mastery was demonstrated through consistency rather than speed. This method emphasized depth of understanding over surface knowledge. Ritual played a key role in preservation. Seasonal ceremonies, communal work, and repeated actions reinforced shared memory. Knowledge was refreshed regularly rather than archived and forgotten. This repetition ensured continuity even without permanent records. Because knowledge was distributed, no single individual possessed everything. Expertise was shared across roles and generations. This decentralization increased resilience. Loss of one person did not erase an entire system, but gradual disruption could weaken it over time. The absence of writing did not mean the absence of abstraction. Concepts such as proportion, timing, and balance were understood implicitly through practice. Language encoded these ideas metaphorically, allowing complex principles to be conveyed without formal terminology. However, this system depended on stability. It required consistent transmission from one generation to the next. When continuity was interrupted, knowledge faded quietly. Migration, demographic shifts, or cultural blending could dilute practices without immediate awareness. Unlike written loss, which is often sudden and visible, oral loss is gradual. Small deviations accumulate. Context erodes. Meaning becomes symbolic rather than functional. Over time, practices may continue without understanding their original purpose. This process explains why some ancient techniques appear partially preserved. Structures are replicated without the full knowledge that once guided them. Rituals persist while their practical functions disappear. What remains becomes tradition rather than instruction. External pressures accelerated this erosion. Environmental change altered conditions under which knowledge developed. Techniques optimized for one climate lost relevance. Adaptation required innovation, but without written reference, reconstruction was difficult. Trade and cultural exchange introduced alternative practices. While enriching, this also fragmented transmission. Multiple systems overlapped, sometimes conflicting. Consensus weakened, reducing clarity of instruction. Social reorganization further contributed. As societies scaled up or centralized, informal transmission became harder. Specialized roles narrowed knowledge pools. When those roles disappeared, so did the expertise they carried. Importantly, loss did not feel catastrophic. Daily life continued. Systems functioned at reduced efficiency. Only over long periods did cumulative effects become visible. Decline appeared natural rather than sudden. Modern interpretation often misreads this silence. Absence of explanation is mistaken for absence of knowledge. In reality, the knowledge existed but left no durable record once transmission stopped. Archaeological remains capture outcomes, not processes. Tools and structures survive, but techniques and reasoning vanish. Without understanding how knowledge was encoded socially, reconstructions remain incomplete. This also challenges assumptions about preservation. Writing is durable but inflexible. Oral systems are adaptive but fragile. Each has strengths and limitations. Ancient societies optimized for continuity under stable conditions, not for survival through extreme disruption. When disruption came through climate shifts, migration, or cultural transformation, oral systems struggled. Written societies fare differently, but not always better. Records preserve information, but without practice, understanding still decays. The quiet disappearance of knowledge does not imply failure. It reflects the conditions under which it evolved. Systems designed for living continuity do not prioritize permanence beyond their context. Recognizing this reframes historical gaps. Instead of searching for missing texts or lost libraries, attention shifts to social structures that once carried meaning. Knowledge loss becomes a social phenomenon rather than an intellectual one. This perspective also explains why rediscovery is difficult. Without understanding the cultural framework, replicating techniques misses essential elements. Tools alone are insufficient without values, rhythms, and shared expectations. Some knowledge survives indirectly. Practices absorbed into neighboring cultures. Techniques simplified and adapted. Fragments persist in unexpected places, disconnected from their origins. Understanding how knowledge was preserved and lost helps explain why advanced systems could disappear without dramatic collapse. When transmission weakens, complexity dissolves quietly. What remains appears simpler, reinforcing misconceptions. This prepares the ground for examining disappearance itself. Not as sudden destruction, but as gradual transformation. Societies did not vanish. They change. And change, when viewed from a distance, can look like absence. The next step is to explore how this transformation unfolded, why so many advanced societies faded without leaving clear endings, and why history often struggles to recognize quiet disappearance as a meaningful outcome. Historical narratives often favor sudden endings. They are easier to record, easier to explain, and easier to remember. Fires, invasions, and dramatic failures leave clear traces. Quiet change does not. For this reason, many ancient societies appear to vanish from history not because they collapsed, but because they transformed in ways that left little immediate evidence. Disappearance can occur through gradual reorganization. Population centers shift. Trade routes change. Environmental conditions evolve. What was once a central hub becomes peripheral. Activity moves elsewhere. Structures are abandoned not in panic, but in sequence as priorities change. Migration plays a major role in this process. Groups relocate in response to climate patterns, resource availability, or social opportunity. Movement is often partial rather than total. Communities fragment, merge, or disperse. Identity continues, but geography changes. Cultural absorption further obscures continuity. When societies interact, practices blend. Names change. Languages evolve. What appears as disappearance in the record may actually be survival under a different form. Without clear boundaries, historians struggle to trace lineage. Economic shifts also drive quiet change. When trade networks realign, centers of production lose relevance. Skills once essential become less valued. Infrastructure falls into disuse. This process unfolds over generations rather than years. Environmental change rarely acts alone. Gradual shifts in rainfall, temperature, or soil composition alter viability. Adaptation requires time and coordination. When responses are fragmented, systems weaken. Decline emerges without a single identifiable cause. Importantly, people do not perceive gradual change as collapse. Life continues. Traditions adapt. Only in hindsight does loss become visible. From within, transformation feels like adjustment rather than failure. Archaeological layers reflect this subtlety. Occupation thins rather than stops. Construction quality changes. Materials shift. These signs indicate transition, not destruction. Modern interpretations often impose dramatic explanations where none exist. Silence in the record invites speculation. Yet absence of evidence is not evidence of catastrophe. Often, it reflects the nature of change itself. Written records amplify this bias. Literate societies document crisis more readily than continuity. When writing declines or shifts, the narrative breaks. Oral cultures leave fewer markers of transition. Power structures also influence visibility. Centralized states leave clearer traces than decentralized communities. When governance becomes more local, evidence fragments. History loses its focal point. This dynamic explains why some advanced systems seem to disappear abruptly. The complexity that sustained them depended on networks rather than monuments. When networks reconfigure, material evidence disperses. The idea of collapse implies failure. But many societies avoided catastrophic endings precisely by changing. Adaptation reduced risk, even if it diminished complexity. Survival took precedence over continuity of form. This reframing challenges modern assumptions. Progress is often equated with scale and permanence. Yet resilience sometimes requires contraction. Letting go can be a strategy rather than a loss. Understanding disappearance as transformation changes how ruins are read. Abandonment does not imply desperation. It may reflect choice, timing, and foresight. This perspective also explains why endings are hard to date. Without singular events, boundaries blur. Histories fade rather than stop. Timelines become approximate. Recognizing quiet disappearance requires patience. It asks historians to accept uncertainty and resist simple narratives. It values process over event. This insight prepares the way to examine what survives such transitions. Even when societies change, fragments of their knowledge, practices, and values persist. Tracing these remnants reveals continuity beneath apparent loss. What survives from ancient societies is rarely a complete picture. Time preserves selectively. Stone endures. Earth shifts. Organic materials decay. What remains is shaped as much by chance as by intention. This uneven survival distorts understanding, creating the illusion of absence where there was once complexity. Ruins are often interpreted as isolated achievements rather than components of larger systems. A wall is examined without its surrounding settlement. A structure is admired without reference to the landscape that supported it. This fragmentation encourages conclusions that emphasize mystery over function. Context is the first casualty of time. Roads that once connected regions erode into faint traces. Fields revert to forest. Water systems silt up. Without these links, surviving elements appear standalone, their original purpose obscured. Scale also misleads interpretation. Monumental structures attract attention, while everyday infrastructure fades. Yet it is often the ordinary system's drainage, storage, pathways that reveal how societies actually functioned. Their disappearance exaggerates the importance of what remains. Modern categorization introduces further distortion. Labels such as ceremonial, symbolic, or religious are applied when practical explanations are unclear. These terms can obscure functionality rather than clarify it. Meaning and utility were not separate categories in many ancient cultures. Repetition across sites is another overlooked clue. Similar layouts, orientations, and construction techniques appear in different locations. This consistency suggests shared standards rather than coincidence. When sites are studied in isolation, these patterns remain invisible. Erosion does not just remove material. It alters perception. Broken edges imply rough construction. Missing elements suggest incompleteness. Yet many structures were once finished, maintained, and integrated into daily life. Their current state reflects abandonment, not original design. Excavation itself shapes narrative. What is uncovered depends on where researchers look and what they expect to find. Bias toward monumental or unusual features reinforces selective interpretation. Ordinary spaces receive less attention despite their importance. Dating methods introduce uncertainty. Layers blur. Reuse complicates timelines. Structures modified over generations resist simple classification. This ambiguity encourages simplified narratives that prioritize clarity over accuracy. The absence of written explanation compounds these issues. Without direct testimony, interpretation relies on analogy and assumption. Modern frameworks fill gaps left by missing voices. These frameworks reflect contemporary values more than ancient realities. Survivorship bias plays a subtle role. What endures is often what was overbuilt or made of durable material. Systems optimized for efficiency and balance may leave fewer traces. Their success becomes invisible precisely because it avoided excess. This bias influences how intelligence is assessed. Monumentality is equated with advancement. Subtlety is overlooked. Yet complexity often hides in restraint rather than scale. Landscape modification provides an example. Terracing, soil management, and water control reshape environments gradually. Once abandoned, these features blend back into nature. Their artificial origins become difficult to recognize without careful study. Artifacts, too, can mislead. Tools found out of context suggest limited use. In reality, toolkits were part of broader processes involving skill, timing, and cooperation. Objects alone cannot convey method. Interpretation is further complicated by continuity. Later societies reused ancient spaces. Materials were repurposed. New meanings layered over old ones. This palimpsest blurs origin and intent. Modern imagination fills these gaps with extremes. Either ancient societies are portrayed as simplistic or endowed with implausible capabilities. Both views miss the nuance revealed by careful analysis. Understanding what remains requires shifting perspective. Instead of asking what is missing, the focus turns to what patterns persist. Alignment, proportion, repetition, and integration offer clues more reliable than isolated artifacts. Comparative study helps restore context. Examining multiple sites together reveals shared principles. Differences highlight adaptation rather than inconsistency. This broader view reduces reliance on speculation. Interdisciplinary approaches further refine interpretation. Geology, ecology, and experimental reconstruction provide insight beyond traditional archaeology. Understanding environment and material behavior illuminates design choices. Silence in the record should be treated cautiously. Lack of evidence may reflect loss rather than absence. Over time, decay erases not just material but memory. Interpretation must account for this erosion. Recognizing misreading as the problem reframes the challenge. Ancient societies did not vanish without trace. Their traces are simply fragmented. Reassembly requires patience and humility. This perspective changes how ruins are experienced. They are no longer puzzles demanding dramatic solutions, but partial records awaiting careful listening. Meaning emerges through accumulation rather than revelation. Accepting incompleteness is essential. Certainty is rare. Probabilities replace absolutes. This openness allows understanding to evolve rather than harden. Ultimately, what remains is enough to challenge assumptions. It reveals societies capable of planning, restraint, and coordination. Their absence in narrative reflects interpretive limits more than historical reality. This realization leads naturally to a broader reflection. If the past is so easily misread, what does that imply about present understanding? And how might future observers interpret the traces left behind today? Modern societies often define success through expansion. Growth is measured in speed, scale, and output. Power is associated with control, extraction, and visibility. Against this framework, ancient societies can appear limited or incomplete. Yet when examined more carefully, their most valuable lessons point in the opposite direction. These societies understood limits not as obstacles, but as boundaries that made stability possible. Environmental constraints were not challenges to overcome at all costs, but conditions to work within. This mindset shaped decisions at every level, from daily labor to long-term planning. Resource use followed rhythms rather than targets. Extraction paused when regeneration was needed. Productivity was balanced against renewal. These choices were not driven by idealism alone, but by practical experience. Exceeding limits carried consequences that could not be postponed or outsourced. This awareness fostered resilience. Systems designed around limits absorb change more effectively than those built for maximum output. When conditions shift, flexibility matters more than scale. Ancient societies prioritized adaptability over dominance. Social organization reflected this philosophy. Hierarchies existed, but they were often moderated by custom and obligation. Authority was constrained by tradition, ritual, and expectation. Leaders were expected to maintain balance rather than pursue unchecked growth. Time horizons extended beyond individual lifespans. Decisions were evaluated based on their impact on descendants. This perspective discouraged short-term exploitation. The future was treated as a shared responsibility rather than an abstract concept. Modern systems often struggle with this temporal disconnect. Immediate gains overshadow long-term costs. Feedback arrives too late to correct course. Ancient societies faced consequences directly, reinforcing cautious behavior. Limits also shaped innovation. Creativity flourished within constraints. Solutions were tailored to context rather than generalized. This produced diversity rather than uniformity. Each society developed methods suited to its environment rather than imposing a single model. This localized intelligence contrasts with modern standardization. Uniform solutions scale efficiently but adapt poorly. Ancient systems sacrificed speed for fit, ensuring compatibility with specific conditions. The emphasis on balance extended to social relations. Cooperation was essential. Competition existed but was moderated. Excessive accumulation threatened stability and was often discouraged culturally. These values were reinforced through narrative. Stories emphasized continuity, caution, and reciprocity. Success was measured by endurance rather than conquest. Memory celebrated stewardship more than domination. The disappearance of these societies does not invalidate these lessons. Their longevity demonstrates effectiveness. Few modern systems can claim comparable stability over centuries. Reframing progress around limits challenges deeply held assumptions. It suggests that more is not always better. That efficiency without balance accelerates fragility. That power without restraint undermines itself. This does not imply rejection of modern technology or ambition. Rather, it invites recalibration. Ancient societies remind us that intelligence includes knowing when to stop. Their lessons are not instructions to return to the past, but insights into human capacity. They show that restraint can be intentional, strategic, and sophisticated. Understanding this shifts interpretation from nostalgia to relevance. The past becomes a source of perspective rather than an idealized alternative. As modern societies confront environmental strain, resource depletion, and social fragmentation, these lessons gain urgency. The challenges are larger in scale, but the principles remain applicable. Limits define systems. Ignoring them does not remove them. It only delays their impact. Ancient societies recognized this reality and structured life accordingly. Their quiet endurance contrasts sharply with modern volatility. Rapid change brings innovation, but also instability. Balance offers continuity at the cost of speed. This trade-off deserves reconsideration. Progress need not abandon restraint. Growth need not erase limits. Power need not override balance. The ancient record does not provide simple solutions. It offers perspective. It reveals that alternative ways of organizing life have existed and succeeded. This awareness reframes the question of advancement. Instead of asking how far societies can go, it asks how long they can last. The value of this question becomes clearer when viewed across centuries. Short-term success fades quickly. Endurance leaves deeper marks. As these lessons emerge from fragmentary evidence, they challenge modern confidence. They suggest humility. They invite reflection rather than imitation. Recognizing limits as wisdom rather than weakness changes how history is read. Ancient societies become teachers rather than curiosities. This perspective prepares the final step in the story. Understanding what these societies were, how they functioned, and what they offer leads to a broader reflection on silence itself, why some of the most meaningful histories speak the least. History often appears loud. It records wars, rulers, disasters, and dramatic turning points. These moments leave clear marks because they disrupt patterns. They demand attention. Yet most human life unfolds quietly, shaped by routines, relationships, and gradual change. This quiet majority rarely announces itself in the historical record. Silence does not mean absence. It reflects what was not prioritized for preservation. Writing, monument building, and official record keeping favor certain perspectives. They capture authority, conflict, and exception. Everyday continuity leaves fewer traces. Advanced societies that valued balance over conquest generated less spectacle. Their success lay in maintenance, rather than expansion. Stability produces fewer dramatic events. As a result, historical visibility diminishes even as functionality remains high. This bias shapes perception. What is recorded feels important. What is unrecorded feels insignificant. Yet importance and visibility are not the same. Many systems that sustained life for centuries did so precisely by avoiding disruption. Silence also emerges from fragility. Materials decay. Oral knowledge fades. Landscapes reclaim infrastructure. Over time, even well-functioning systems dissolve into subtle traces. Without deliberate preservation, complexity disappears quietly. Historical narratives often mistake this quiet disappearance for simplicity. When evidence is sparse, assumptions fill the gap. The absence of records becomes evidence of absence of sophistication. This misreading is compounded by modern expectations. We expect intelligence to announce itself through technology, scale, or speed. Ancient societies expressed intelligence through restraint, fit, and continuity, qualities that leave lighter footprints. The silence of these societies challenges how history is valued. It suggests that survival without spectacle may be undervalued. That endurance may matter more than visibility. Selective silence also reflects power. Groups with fewer resources to document themselves leave fewer traces. Their stories are overridden by those with greater means. History becomes uneven not because experience was unequal, but because preservation was. This unevenness distorts chronology. Loud events dominate timelines. Quiet processes vanish between dates. Continuity fractures into episodes, masking gradual evolution. Recognizing silence as selective changes interpretation. Gaps become questions rather than conclusions. Absence invites investigation rather than dismissal. This approach requires humility. It accepts uncertainty. It resists filling silence with convenient explanations. It acknowledges that not all knowledge survives intact. Silence also protects nuance. Without fixed narratives, interpretation remains open. Meanings evolve as new evidence emerges. Understanding deepens rather than closes. In this sense, silence preserves potential. It allows the past to speak differently to each generation. What was once overlooked becomes relevant when perspectives change. Modern technology amplifies this effect. New tools reveal traces previously invisible, subtle alignments, soil modifications, microscopic wear patterns. Silence begins to speak, not through words, but through pattern. As these signals accumulate, the quiet achievements of ancient societies become clearer. Their intelligence was not lost. It was simply unannounced. This realization reframes the role of the historian. Interpretation shifts from storytelling to listening. From imposing narrative to recognizing pattern. Silence becomes a source of information rather than an obstacle. It highlights what a society valued enough to maintain without recording. It reveals priorities embedded in practice rather than proclamation. Understanding silence also reshapes how modern societies might be remembered. What will remain visible centuries from now? What will fade despite importance? Visibility does not guarantee significance. This awareness invites reflection on preservation itself. What is recorded reflects choice. What is forgotten reflects neglect. Neither is neutral. The quiet disappearance of advanced societies does not diminish their achievement. It underscores a different relationship with time, one that does not require recognition to validate existence. Their legacy survives not in chronicles, but in patterns of human possibility. They demonstrate that complex life can be organized without domination, without excess, and without constant declaration. Silence, then, is not a failure of history. It is a feature of it. It reminds us that meaning does not always announce itself. Sometimes it endures quietly, waiting to be noticed. This understanding brings the story close to its conclusion. With organization, engineering, timekeeping, sustainability, knowledge transmission, transformation, misinterpretation, and restraint now considered, one final question remains. What does all of this change about how we see ourselves and what kind of traces we are choosing to leave behind? From a distance, modern civilization looks unstoppable. Cities expand outward and upward. Technology accelerates communication, production, and control. Systems interlock across continents. Power appears centralized, optimized, and permanent. Yet this appearance can be misleading. Complexity does not automatically produce resilience. In many cases, it does the opposite. Highly interconnected systems depend on constant stability. When one component fails, consequences cascade. The margin for error narrows as efficiency increases. Ancient societies often accepted inefficiency as a form of insurance. Redundancy existed not to maximize output, but to absorb disruption. Multiple food sources, overlapping social roles, and flexible settlement patterns allowed adjustment without collapse. Modern systems prioritize speed and scale. Optimization removes buffers. Processes become precise but brittle. When conditions remain favorable, performance is high. When they shift, recovery becomes difficult. This contrast reshapes how advancement is measured. Progress is often equated with innovation. Yet innovation without resilience accelerates vulnerability. Ancient societies innovated more slowly, but their changes integrated deeply before replacing existing systems. Time horizons illustrate the difference. Modern planning frequently operates within short cycles, quarters, years, electoral terms. Consequences beyond these windows are abstract. Ancient decision-making extended across generations. Feedback loops were direct and unavoidable. This difference affects behavior. When consequences are delayed or diffused, risk-taking increases. When consequences are immediate and local, caution dominates. Ancient societies experienced limits directly. Modern societies often experience them indirectly. Resource use highlights this gap. Extraction today is often geographically separated from consumption. Impact is displaced. Ancient societies lived within the effects of their choices. Degradation was visible. Recovery was necessary. This proximity shaped values. Stewardship emerged not as moral preference, but as practical necessity. Overuse threatened survival. Balance protected continuity. Modern abundance alters perception. Scarcity feels temporary. Solutions appear external. This reduces urgency to adapt behavior. Yet underlying limits remain unchanged. Social cohesion also differs. Ancient societies relied on trust and shared norms. Systems functioned because individuals believed others would act predictably. Modern systems rely more heavily on enforcement and automation. Trust is outsourced to structure. This shift increases efficiency but weakens adaptability. When systems fail, recovery requires centralized intervention rather than communal response. Local knowledge becomes less relevant. Knowledge transmission reflects similar fragility. Modern information storage is vast but dependent on infrastructure. Without power or access, information becomes inaccessible. Ancient knowledge lived in practice, resilient to technological failure but vulnerable to social disruption. Neither system is superior in all conditions. Each reflects trade-offs shaped by environment and values. The danger lies in assuming permanence. Historical perspective reveals how quickly complexity can unravel. When conditions change faster than adaptation, systems strain. Ancient societies experienced this. Modern societies are not exempt. The scale is different, but the principles remain. Interdependence magnifies both strength and weakness. Growth accelerates both benefit and risk. This realization challenges confidence in linear progress. Advancement does not accumulate safely by default. It must be maintained deliberately. Resilience requires intentional design. Ancient societies embedded resilience culturally. Limits were normalized. Restraint was reinforced socially. Modern societies often rely on correction after failure. This difference affects how decline manifests. Ancient change was gradual. Modern disruption can be sudden. High-speed systems fail quickly when thresholds are crossed. Understanding this does not diminish modern achievement. It contextualizes it. It highlights the need for humility rather than rejection. Ancient societies demonstrate that stability is an achievement, not a baseline. Endurance requires effort. Silence in history often marks success rather than insignificance. Recognizing fragility reframes responsibility. It shifts focus from expansion to maintenance, from novelty to continuity, from dominance to balance. The comparison is not an argument to abandon modernity. It is a reminder that intelligence includes foresight, that power includes restraint, that progress includes preservation. This awareness prepares the final reflection. After examining what ancient societies were, how they functioned, how they changed, and what they reveal about limits, one concluding insight remains. History does not only tell us where humanity has been. It quietly asks what kind of future we are building and how it will be remembered when the noise fades. When advanced societies disappear from history, what remains is often described as silence. No written records continue. No monuments receive upkeep. No voices speak directly across time. Yet silence does not mean emptiness. Silence is what remains when noise fades. It is not the absence of existence, but the absence of narration. What vanishes is not life itself, but the structures that preserve attention. Ancient societies that declined quietly did not necessarily fail dramatically. Many did not collapse in fire or conquest. They dissolved. They transformed. They thinned out, adapted, merged, or moved on. Their continuity did not always align with how history chooses to remember. History favors moments of spectacle. Wars, disasters, revolutions, and destruction leave sharp edges in the record. Gradual success leaves little trace. Stability does not announce itself. Balance rarely demands attention. This bias shapes perception. Societies remembered as lost may have succeeded in their most fundamental task, avoiding catastrophe. They may have chosen continuity over dominance, adaptation over expansion, survival over legacy. Their silence is not proof of weakness. It may be evidence of restraint. Memory depends on disruption. What remains visible or breaks, not flows. Quiet transitions blend into time. Loud endings carve markers. This reframes how advancement is judged. Progress measured only by expansion overlooks endurance. Achievement measured only by scale ignores sustainability. Legacy measured only by monuments misses influence. Ancient societies embedded knowledge into behavior rather than text. They encoded values in ritual, land use, social norms, and shared practice. When written records disappeared, these systems could continue invisibly. Modern societies record extensively but practice selectively. Information is abundant, yet often detached from daily life. When systems fail, stored knowledge may not translate into action. This difference shapes survival. Knowledge that lives only in archives is fragile. Knowledge that lives in habits persists. Silence can therefore indicate integration. When something works well enough, it becomes invisible. Attention shifts elsewhere. Documentation fades because repetition replaces explanation. Nature operates the same way. Stable ecosystems do not announce themselves. Collapse draws attention. Balance goes unnoticed. Ancient societies aligned more closely with this pattern. They did not seek to be remembered. They sought to endure. Modern culture often inverts this priority. Visibility becomes value. Recognition becomes goal. Legacy is planned rather than lived. This changes behavior. Decisions optimize for short-term impact rather than long-term stability. Systems grow louder, not stronger. The disappearance of ancient societies challenges this mindset. It suggests that survival does not require constant assertion. That significance does not require permanence in record. Silence becomes a different kind of success. This perspective alters how decline is interpreted. Decline is not always failure. It can be transition. It can be diffusion. It can be absorption into new forms. Human continuity does not require fixed structures. It requires adaptability. Many ancient societies dissolved into others, contributing ideas, practices, and genetics without retaining identity. Their influence persists without attribution. This is another form of endurance. Impact without authorship. Continuity without recognition. Modern systems resist this. Identity is protected. Institutions preserve themselves. Change is resisted until it becomes unavoidable. This resistance increases fragility. Flexibility is delayed. Adaptation becomes reactive rather than proactive. Ancient societies adapted earlier because limits were visible. Modern societies often adapt later because limits are abstracted. The lesson is not nostalgia. It is perspective. Silence invites listening rather than judgment. It encourages humility rather than certainty. It asks what is missing from the record and why. What disappears from history is not always what mattered least. Often it is what integrated most fully into life. This realization reframes ambition. It suggests that not all progress needs to be recorded to be real. Not all success needs to be visible to matter. The future will judge the present not by its declarations, but by its outcomes. Not by its noise, but by what remains when attention moves on. Modern civilization may leave vast records. But records alone do not guarantee understanding. Without continuity, they become artifacts rather than guidance. Ancient societies left fewer records, but some left balance, knowledge of limits, and examples of adaptation that remain relevant. The question is not whether modern society will be remembered. It is how it will be understood. Will it be seen as resilient or fragile? Balanced or excessive? Adaptable or rigid? Silence does not erase existence. It filters it. What survives is what integrates. The civilizations that vanished quietly may not have sought to outlast time. They may have chosen instead to live within it. Their stories do not end. They disperse. History does not close their chapters with conclusions. It leaves margins open. In those margins, reflection replaces narrative. Meaning replaces spectacle. The absence of noise invites attention to patterns rather than events, to systems rather than moments, to continuity rather than climax. This is where the past speaks most clearly, not through ruins or texts, but through contrast. It reminds us that endurance is not dramatic. That balance is not loud. That survival often leaves no monument. When the future looks back, it may not remember what was said the loudest. It may remember what lasted the longest. And in that remembering, silence will not be emptiness. It will be memory. As this story comes to an end, what remains is not a single conclusion, but a quiet awareness. The past does not offer clear instructions, only patterns. It does not warn loudly, but it repeats itself patiently. Advanced societies did not vanish because they lacked intelligence. Many disappeared because they reached limits they did not fully recognize, or recognized too late. What history leaves behind is not a verdict, but a mirror. In that reflection, progress and fragility exist side by side. Growth and balance negotiate constantly. Endurance proves to be less about how far a society expands, and more about how well it listens to its environment, to its people, and to time itself. The civilizations that faded into silence were not failures. They were experiments in being human under specific conditions. Some adapted. Some transformed. Some dissolved quietly, leaving no dramatic ending, only continuity in new forms. Their absence invites us to slow down, to question assumptions about permanence, and to reconsider what it truly means to advance. Not everything that matters is recorded. Not everything that lasts demands attention. Sometimes, survival is quiet. And perhaps that is the final lesson hidden between the lines of history. That the most enduring achievements are often the least visible, and the most powerful stories are the ones that ask us to reflect rather than react. Thank you for spending this time with the past, and for listening to what history does not always say out loud. If you found meaning or calm in this journey, feel free to stay, rest, and return for the next story. Until then, take care and good night.